Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Land in India is always in high demand. Between that high demand, poor governance, worse land records, there is often intense conflict, with and without bloodshed. Kumar Sambhav of Land Conflicts Watch is here today to discuss land conflicts in the context of industrialization and city growth, especially during this year of the pandemic. Sambhav, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thanks so much, Pavan.
And Sambhav, I want to dive right in. Post-lockdown, we've seen many announcements from state and union governments to woo manufacturing and industries from abroad. This includes a set of changes in rules and laws around land, its sale and its use as well. Do you see these changes as creating new conflicts, or do you think some of them will actually reduce some of the reasons for ongoing land conflicts?
Thanks so much, Pavan, for having me here. And before I actually dive into this question, I would like to give a little background of land conflicts and why it matters. At Land Conflict Watch, over the past 3 years, we have done intensive study of granular data of ongoing 703 land conflicts from across India. And then we realized that in these 703 land conflicts, there are 6.5 million people affected right now as we speak. 13.7 lakh crore of investment, which is almost US dollar 190 billion, is embroiled in these 703 ongoing land conflicts in India. And by land conflicts, we mean where communities, people on the ground, a bunch of families oppose change in ownership or use of land.
So Sambhav, you mentioned 703 conflicts, right? So when you're talking about a conflict, could you give us one or two examples perhaps to help us figure out the size of one conflict?
So when we defined this study and we were trying to design this, we sort of figured that, in India, issues of land disputes are huge. If you take, for example, your studies about Indian courts, maximum number of pending cases in Indian courts are because of property and land disputes. But we realize that when we're talking about public land conflict, which means where public as a bunch of families is getting affected, that's where we see that the conflicts become much bigger. When it's not about one family or it's not about a family dispute between property. So we have sort of defined what do we mean by land conflict when we do a study, which is where a community as a part of public, a community of citizens, is sort of fighting against any other party for a certain demand or certain concern regarding the use or ownership of land. And we say that at least 10 families should be involved in this kind of contest. Then we, at least on one side, then we start documenting that case. And we also follow up on that case as it evolves. And the scale of these conflicts could be, as I said, could be anywhere between 10 families to 50,000 people being affected by certain conflicts.
So it goes up to 50,000 people among what you're documenting right now.
Right. Like, for example, if you see this new capital being built in Andhra Pradesh, Amaravati, which is like huge. It's probably one of the biggest conflict, and it involves like thousands of families, tens of thousands of families, which are affected by land conflict. So there are like 3 cities almost being developed by the state for creating a new capital, but there are huge issues about people do not want to give land, how they want to give land, what kind of compensation they are seeking, but the policies that the state is designing around the way they are taking land from people. So there are like number of conflicts within one conflict arising out of there. So we have these kind of conflicts, as well as say in one particular city, a bridge is being built. And there is a locality there which is houses are going to be demolished for that bridge. So we have that local level conflicts also, which could be multiple within a city.
Got it. So then before I come to, post-pandemic and the new laws, then let me ask you a little about what are the general natures of conflict that you see as cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad and Amravati might be a unique case, but as large cities try and grow and expand, are some of these conflicts inevitable or are they happening at a much larger rate in India because our laws and governance systems don't know how to deal with the growth of cities and industrialization?
Right. I won't say that our legal system doesn't really is equipped to deal with these conflicts. India has an array of laws which actually sort of govern the equitable sharing of land resources, a more equitable negotiation when land is acquired for a certain project. So we already have a number of laws which do that. Do we have enough of those laws and do they cover all kind of conflicts? I would say no. There are still lots of legal gaps which needs to be filled in terms of laws. And I'll come to that later. But to go back to your first question on this, that how as cities develop and we go about development and what kind of trend we have seen. So in the last 3 years, we have seen that infrastructure projects related conflicts are the highest. And within infrastructure, the highest are because of real estate and township projects. And after that, it's about roads. So as you rightly pointed out, that as India grows, more and more urban areas expand, we need better connectivity. So more and more roads, more and more wider roads. And real estate and townships. So all these activities are the highest contributors of conflicts. Now, what generally happens when we talk about laws, as I said, we have certain number of laws which are sort of deal with equitable negotiations where all parties can come together and decide. We have Land Acquisition Act of 2013, which sort of talks about consent of landowners when they give land. It has enhanced compensation manifold from the previous land acquisition law. It also talks about rehabilitation and resettlement for all displaced and dependent families. What happens generally is that these processes take time, and often the project developers and administration, one, do not have the patience to go through the entire process of consultation, social impact assessment, etc. How many people are affected. So those things are often the administration takes shortcut in these processes, often bypassing these laws and taking over the land through administrative fiat. While these kind of actions, bypassing the laws or taking shortcuts, violating some of the provisions, it could give them administrative approvals quickly, because that's the ultimate purpose, is that you want a project to come up quickly and also be cheaper. So you don't want to maybe pay as much compensation, so you won't go through this law. But ultimately what happens, while you may get approvals and you may get through on administrative front, your papers might be all okay that your project is clearing, there will be huge conflict on the ground. People will protest on the ground. If they feel that they are being given short shrift during the process of land acquisition, they'll resort to litigations. So huge number of projects are actually stuck in courts just because the proper due process of consultation, consent, compensation, resettlement was not followed, shortcuts were taken. So I think the understanding within the administration and project developers that they can roughshod through the demands of communities and landowners by administrative fiat only serves little purpose. It in fact becomes counterproductive when these projects get stuck in courts and on the ground protest, which causes much more delay and which causes a lot of cost escalation for these projects. So ultimately it helps no one. Industry suffers, and when project is stuck, the livelihood of that employment that would have been created, that also suffers, while these conflicts also have their human rights violation angle and land rights violation angle.
Sambhav, from everything that you tell me, land acquisition seems to be central to a lot of the conflicts that are happening. Do you think this is a failure in and of itself? Doesn't land acquisition become an issue when the free and direct sale of land fails? I'm just trying to get a sense of why and where the failure is happening.
Right. I think to an extent I would agree, and there are certain disagreements also in that statement. So it's mostly between the landowners and whoever is trying to buy that land or use that land. It would be about private negotiation, about buying and selling. What generally happens is, as you rightly said, that fair value, market value of the land, you get actually much equal negotiation power when it's a direct purchase. People would, the industry would come and say, this is the market value of the land and this is what I'll give you. But in land acquisition, actually, it gives a much better rate. It says that in urban areas, you have 2 times the value of the land that landowners can get, and in rural areas, 4 times. So when there is a law which gives them much higher value of land, people want to go through the land acquisition law. Second reason for a lot of communities to go through land acquisition law is that it does not take care of the people who are dependent on land and not necessarily owning the land. When you have direct purchase, then only the landowners get the compensation. But a lot of people are just dependent on these lands, especially in rural areas and on agricultural land. They don't have any resettlement, rehabilitation, or any indirect compensation for their dependency, which actually the land acquisition law takes care of. So for these 2 reasons is what the land acquisition law comes. But yes, a lot of cases when the developers are willing to pay the amount that people actually want, it could be quick. It generally, people would be happy to get a fair price of their land. And especially in rural areas, they would settle outside in urban areas once they get the money. So it's the willingness of the project developers and the administration that whether they want to pay the amount that the landowners feel is their due value of the land, plus other people who are affected on that land. They would always protest if they are not getting any sort of compensation. Now, that brings me to much bigger finding of our study, which is beyond land acquisition and private purchase, which is that more than 2/3 of our conflicts, which is 68% of the conflicts that we have documented, actually involves common land, the common property resources as we call, which are not private ownerships. And that exactly is, I think, a very big problem which even governments and administrations have so far not really given much attention to, because all the debates about land acquisition revolves around private land acquisition.
You give us an example, Sambhav?
So what happens is private land, you still have clear ownership or clear titles, ownership of people. But there are huge, in India, there is a big land administrative problem, especially in the forest lands and other village common lands, where local communities, villagers, tribals have traditional customary rights. For example, you take tribal communities. They have been living in forest land for generations, for centuries, but our forests are administered by the colonial laws of Indian Forest Act of 1927, which the British government actually enacted because they wanted to take over the ownership of forest land in India. And that law still continues now. So people who were living in forest land, tribals and other non-tribal forest dwellers also, they overnight became encroachers, and they still, while they live, they use the forest land, they have all their traditional practices on forest land, they are still treated as encroachers because forest lands are government lands. Now, this was changed in 2006 when a new law, which is called Forest Right Act, was passed. And the Forest Right Act actually says that it was passed to undo the historical injustices done to tribals, non-tribal forest dwellers. So people can file their claims on forest land they were traditionally occupying or using, and they can get titles over it. This law really doesn't get implemented across the country because the forest administration resists ceding control from the forest land. So there are huge problems about who owns forest land and who uses forest land. There is a huge gap of any legal provision for addressing similar traditional rights of local communities on non-forest common lands. So each village would have these gochar lands, or where their livestock goes for grazing. Then they have water bodies, wetlands that they use. They have some revenue forest lands also where they collect firewood, etc. And a lot of landless people actually live on those lands. So the village community would itself decide that, okay, we have this huge common land which is lying there. It's everybody's. These are the landless families, they can live there. So there would be these local customary traditions where people are living. But when a project comes, all these common lands are considered as government land, and government just assigns these land to projects and project developers without recognizing these ground situations of traditional rights and without compensating people for that. and which often leads to litigations, which often leads to conflict on the ground. And that's why a larger number of conflicts and investment are stuck on common lands. And this happens a lot in peri-urban areas.
So Sambhav, so how much of this happens in peri-urban areas? We have some of our cities which are encroaching into forest territory. Even in Bangalore, we are at the border of the Bannerghatta National Park. But how much of it is far more removed? Because coming back to like one of the focuses of our conversation today, right? I don't know if we can do full justice to the topic of tribal rights on this particular episode. I certainly hope that we can in the future. But do you see the Forest Rights Act and traditional rights being infringed on even at the edges of cities? One. And two, when you mentioned land conflicts in cities, you largely mentioned infrastructure and townships. What about industries? Are they not a big part of the urban or peri-urban picture, and happening more farther away from cities?
Yeah. So on your first question first, forest lands not as much, and in the peri-urban areas, but definitely common lands which are not forests. They are a huge part of conflicts which would be in the peri-urban area. Eventually, what happens is all your cities start eating into the nearby village lands. So your neighboring villages would be consumed in the cities as the cities expand, and their land administration and land governance in rural areas, even like for our purpose of understanding, we can say municipal area and a village panchayat area. So as cities expand within the municipality, you will have a lot of village panchayats being consumed with every new urban plan of expansion every 10 years or every 20 years. So the administration of land in village panchayats and rural areas is very different from the urban. Similarly, the use of such lands on the ground is also very different. So every time when you are expanding into a rural area, these common lands are the easy target for quick expansion. You will say, oh, these are all government lands, and then they take them over.
So by common lands, would these be traditionally used as grazing lands? Like, what would be the traditional uses of that common land in villages that then gets reappropriated in a different way?
Right. So, I mean, the common examples are grazing land, water bodies for water. You will see even in the cities, your water bodies getting captured, but more so the rural wetlands are also a huge source of, resource and livelihood for people. So water bodies, fishing in those water bodies, grazing land. You have these cultural sites also, like graveyards of different communities. So these are the common ones, while it could be very local specific also, which we may not know. So every village might have, like I said, that each village might have a lot of landless people, but they would live somewhere. Within the communities, they decide that, okay, the landless people would be occupying this common land, and nobody in the village has a problem because it's collectively decided. So they would live on those lands. A lot of times they even cultivate. So landless people cultivate a lot of these common lands as well, which the community collectively decide that, okay, this family would be cultivating this much land, while it's on record, it's all government land.
So then the big challenge would be the reconciliation of property rights on paper that are recognized under law and the traditional and the natural rights of people who are either using it, dwelling there, or doing various things with said land, right? And that disconnect allows for urban growth to become nastier than it ought to be.
Correct. And eventually it becomes problem even for administration, because they would not see it if they're just going by what's there on the paper and not the actual situation on the ground. So I understand that, the Forest Right Act and Tribal Right Act is a little far removed from when we talk about urban and peri-urban. But that's one example where this reconciliation has, even in non-forest areas, which would be much closer to urban and peri-urban areas, there has to be a mechanism where you reconcile these traditional rights on commons and figure out a mechanism to actually compensate people for the loss of that livelihood and those traditional rights.
Absolutely. I think we'll have to figure that out, otherwise the conflict will be getting ugly and won't help anyone and will obviously hurt certain people more than others. So, Sambhav, the second part of my question, how much of the land conflicts do you see around the edges of cities actually involve industries?
I mean, I haven't really looked at that kind of data yet, so I won't be able to say confidently that, this is the share, this is the percentage and all. But generally, from a sense from tracking these conflicts over the years, I would say big industrial projects, not so much in the periphery of the urban areas. As I said, infrastructure is something that really helps, and industry would tend to actually take land which is generally cheaper and a little far away from urban growth, where they can, because the vast tracts are available also in those regions. So that would be my general sense from understanding. But in our study now, we are actually categorizing the conflicts on the basis of rural and urban demarcation as well. And hopefully, in about a year, when we have relooked at all this data from this categorization, we would be able to give a better sense of what really affects urban vis-a-vis rural.
Thanks, Sambhav. So, in all of this, right, the recent changes that have been announced in one part as ordinances, in one part as rule changes. I don't think any laws have been passed in Parliament yet. Some of the changes that you're seeing around land, do you see them address any of the ongoing conflicts or at least future conflicts?
To come to your question, I think there is definitely a reason right now that all this policy churning is happening, and we are seeing a lot of push towards what is being said as reform to help investors and attract more and more investment, because we clearly see geopolitical shift as a lot of American and European investors are fleeing China, and India looks like the most suitable and proximate option as an alternative destination for this. So that seems to be a reason why there is this kind of push for easing the administrative approvals for taking over land, its use, its ownership, etc., etc. In fact, we see government has announced a number of even dilutions in environmental and forest laws, which cuts the process of approvals and gives directly available land to people. There are, in fact, huge push within these state governments to create something what is called land banks. So they are already putting a lot of land which they call as wasteland in land banks, and when an investor comes, they'll say, oh, we already have this land, you can take it. This falls in the same trap that when you are cutting on the administrative approvals, you're actually, what they do is they try to bypass these provisions which actually ensure equitable negotiation of land takeover, just because it takes much more time, and sometimes it's expensive because you have to pay more compensation when you go by the demand of people. So taking shortcuts and bypassing is what these reforms seem to be, bypassing the progressive laws and taking shortcuts on these progressive provisions of land acquisition, which eventually will end up in conflicts on the ground, as I said, or in litigations. We really need to have a study to see how the delays caused by litigations or delays caused by these on the ground protests in project, what is the cost of that? And I'm sure it would be much more than if you actually go by doing equitable negotiations and consultations and agreeing to compensation, take consent. It will be much smoother if they do that, which is not being considered even the new steps these administration or the government is taking to attract investment. And this, in fact, will not go a long way. It won't even sustain, because globally there is much more consciousness among investors, and there is a lot of criticism of irresponsible investments in a places or in projects which eventually get criticized for land rights violations, for human rights violations. So investors now are getting wary of getting this kind of criticism eventually if there are any kind of violations from people on ground or complaints from people on ground. I think this understanding that how do you comply to progressive laws, while you could cut on some other administrative processes which may make it quicker, that needs to develop, and not the kind of dilutions that we are seeing right now. For example, they say, oh, consent, no requirement in these certain kind of projects. Or they would say state can create their own laws and they don't have to comply to the land acquisition law of 2013, and no need for resettlement or rehabilitation of dependent families. So, I mean, you'll see every state has come up with bypasses for for these provisions, which they think are time consuming or expensive. But I mean, the real understanding is still not developing in these steps, which could benefit both industry and people.
And Sambhav, we don't even know if some of these changes will stand the test of law, right?
Yeah, that's also because I mean, a lot of litigations are on these changes itself. So when you go through these changes, when you take land under these changes, farmers and landowners are much more aware nowadays about what the law says, what the legal provisions are, and they would go to court if they feel that they are being given short shrift in the process.
Thank you, Sambhav. And I agree. I mean, there's a reason why I did not use the word reform ever, but just changes in laws, because a lot of what we are seeing, I'm not convinced they amount to sustainable reform that can actually improve the situation. Like you said, if the on-ground situation is no different than before, and if people can both take to courts and take to protests, then this may not serve the needs of investors who are coming in with the intent of setting up industries or companies or other things. So, Sambhav, you've been running Land Conflicts Watch along with your colleagues for 3 years now. Is there anything in this space that gives you a little bit of hope? Is there anything that you see happening that feels like some of the conflicts that can be avoided, or some of the conflicts whose intensities can be reduced, are being reduced because of proactive governance and proactive measures? Is there anything that gives you a glimmer of hope, at least?
Now, the process of even hoping that certain conflicts would resolve within 2 or 3 years is, I mean, a tall order to hope something like that, because we looked at data and there are conflicts that go for decades. But some of the older conflicts did get resolved in this process. So we have on our website, we have documented all the conflicts that have gotten resolved in the past 3 years as we were documenting. And what we figured that what has resolved them is the exact things that actually, I mean, the root cause, when we have identified that these are the root cause for conflicts, which is one, their rights not getting compensated, their livelihoods not getting compensated, the compensation that is promised to them is not enough according to people's assessment, or even the promised compensation is not given. And fourth, the consent is violated. So these are the 4 problems that we identified in most of the conflicts. Now, in some cases, the administration went back to the drawing board. They agreed to the demands. They resolved the core issue instead of just doing the administrative fiat. And in some cases, they changed the design or shape of the project to avoid this confrontation.
So, Sambhav, thank you. I mean, that's really interesting to know that the things that could have been done right in the first place, when they were eventually done, that was pretty much the only way that the conflicts got resolved. But you talked about resolution. Do you also come across cases where it is not a resolution in any genuine sense of the word, but that the conflict has been concluded in one way or another, but people have not gotten their dues in the end?
I'm glad you asked that question. So in fact, when we were documenting the resolution, we first thought that when a conflict gets closed, we'll document how the conflict gets resolved. And eventually we realized that conflict might actually be getting closed, but it's not resolution in the genuine sense, as you rightly pointed out. So there would be instances where court has given an order against the community's wish, and then they don't feel and they don't see that there is an option, so they might given up. Sometimes their voices are not heard, and then they are also curbed, and eventually people are forcefully displaced, and eventually there is no conflict. So, and sometimes also a development project does not come up for reasons other than the conflict. It could be their investors' problem, or a political change, or a government change in a particular region or a state which doesn't want to pursue the same project. So those kind of instances do also happen through which conflict dies. But I would say that a specific conflict may die because of such, say, when you roughshod over the demand of communities, then and community loses its voice or is forcefully displaced. But in the long run, I mean, this could create much bigger human rights crisis, etc. in the region. And if we go back and see the root cause of Naxal problem in the central forest areas or in some of the areas in Northeast, it's basically been dispossession of land and also resource alienation, which was done through force. So while a particular conflict in a specific area might die, it could create 2 much bigger humanitarian crises. if this is the approach that project developers keep taking.
Thank you, Sambhav. And thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks today and really shedding some light on the nature of these conflicts that are not just one-off, not just rare, but are everyday conflicts that people have to deal with. Pandemic or no pandemic, lockdown or no lockdown, these are conflicts that affect, as you said, millions and millions of lives across the country. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Pavan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.